The August heat pressed down on Atlanta like a physical weight, the kind of suffocating warmth that turned asphalt into a shimmering mirage and made the air taste like exhaust and desperation. At 6:45 in the morning, the temperature had already climbed past 80 degrees, and Lieutenant Sarah Collins could feel sweat gathering at the small of her back as she stood in the parking lot of the Atlanta Police Department's K-9 training facility, watching the black SUV pull through the security gate. Max sat at her heel, his muscular frame perfectly still, ears rotating like satellite dishes, tracking the approaching vehicle. His coat gleamed in the early sunlight, and his dark eyes held that particular intensity that Sarah had learned to read over 7 years of partnership. Right now, those eyes were fixed on the SUV with an alertness that seemed excessive for what should have been a routine introduction. The vehicle stopped 20 feet away, and the driver's door opened. Officer Derek Mercer stepped out, adjusting his uniform as he walked toward her. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders and the kind of precisely maintained physique that spoke of discipline and dedication. His blonde hair was cut regulation short, his face clean-shaven, his boots polished to a mirror shine, despite the dust already settling on everything in this heat. Sarah had reviewed his file twice. 12 years on the force in Houston, commendations for bravery, expertise in tactical operations, transfer approved with glowing recommendations from his captain and 2 lieutenants. On paper, Derek Mercer was exactly the kind of officer any department would be lucky to have. He stopped 3 feet away and extended his hand with a smile that showed perfect white teeth. Professional, confident, the smile of a man who knew exactly how good his record looked. Sarah shook his hand, firm grip, dry palm despite the heat. She noticed his eyes flick down to Max for just a fraction of a second before returning to her face. "Welcome to Atlanta, Officer Mercer," she said. "I'm Lieutenant Collins. This is Max." Mercer nodded, his smile unwavering. "Lieutenant, I've heard impressive things about your unit, and about Max here." He shifted his attention to the dog, his posture relaxed, his voice taking on that slightly higher pitch people often used with animals. "Hey there, boy. Looks like we're going to be working together." He took a step forward, hand extended toward Max. Max exploded. The growl came from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound Sarah had only heard a handful of times in their years together and never directed at a fellow officer. His lips peeled back, exposing teeth that gleamed white against his dark muzzle. Every muscle in his body went rigid, and he lunged forward against his training, something he simply did not do. Sarah's hand dropped to his collar instinctively, though she knew she barely needed to. Max stopped himself at the edge of his invisible boundary, but his eyes never left Mercer, and the growl continued, low and constant, like the warning rumble before an earthquake. "Max," she said sharply, "heel." He retreated to her side, but his posture remained aggressive, hackles raised, weight forward on his front paws. His gaze stayed locked on Mercer with an intensity that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Mercer had taken 2 quick steps backward, his hands raised, his smile replaced by an expression of carefully controlled surprise. "Whoa, did I do something wrong?" Sarah shook her head, though her mind was racing. "No, this isn't like him. Give me a minute." She led Max away, putting distance between them and Mercer. When they were 30 feet away, she knelt beside her partner, her hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension vibrating through his muscles like a live wire. "What is it?" she murmured, her voice low enough that Mercer couldn't hear. "What's wrong with him?" Max's eyes finally left Mercer to meet hers, and in that moment, Sarah saw something she couldn't explain. It wasn't aggression, not really, it was warning. It was the same look he gave her when he detected explosives, when he found drugs hidden in a car's wheel well, when he sensed danger before she could see it. But there was nothing here, just a parking lot, a hot morning, and a new officer with a pristine record. She stood up, decision made. The decision that would haunt her for the next 12 hours. She walked Max to his kennel in the training facility, ignoring the way he pulled against her. The way he kept looking back at Mercer. She secured him in his enclosure, and when she turned to leave, he pressed against the chain link, a soft whine escaping his throat. "It's okay, boy," she said. "I'll be back." She walked away from the only partner who had never let her down. The first 4 hours of the shift were uneventful. Sarah drove while Mercer rode shotgun, asking all the right questions, making all the right observations. He was knowledgeable about Atlanta's geography for someone who had just transferred, but he explained that he had spent 2 weeks studying maps and crime statistics before arriving. He was familiar with their protocols, their communication systems, their chain of command. He was, in every measurable way, exactly what his file said he was. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was nothing she could point to, nothing that would hold up in any kind of report, just a vague sense of wrongness that she attributed to Max's reaction and her own exhaustion from the heat. They responded to a domestic disturbance that turned out to be a couple arguing about air conditioning repairs. They took a report from a convenience store owner who claimed someone had been casing his shop. They helped direct traffic around a fender bender on Peachtree Street while the drivers exchanged insurance information in the sweltering heat. Normal, routine, the kind of shift that made up 95% of police work. It was just past 11 when the call came in. All units. "We have a report of suspicious activity at the Westfield Industrial Complex, 4400 Marietta Boulevard. Caller reports possible trespassers in Building 7. Any unit available to respond?" Sarah picked up the radio. "Unit K-9 7 responding. ETA 15 minutes. Mercer glanced at her. "Industrial complex?" "Old warehouses," she said, pulling a U-turn. "Most of them are abandoned. We get calls out there sometimes, usually just homeless people looking for shelter, kids looking for a place to party." She paused. "Sometimes we find drug operations, meth labs, storage for stolen goods. Sounds like the kind of place you'd want a K-9. Sarah felt a flicker of irritation and pushed it down. He wasn't wrong. Max would be useful for a building search. But Max was back at the facility, and she wasn't going to explain to Mercer why she had left him there. "We'll do a preliminary assessment," she said. "If we need additional resources, we'll call for backup." The Westfield Industrial Complex was a graveyard of American manufacturing, a collection of massive brick and concrete buildings that had once housed textile mills and auto parts factories. Now they stood empty, windows broken, walls covered in graffiti, slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and Georgia heat. Building 7 was at the far end of the complex, separated from the others by a cracked parking lot where weeds pushed through the asphalt. Sarah parked the cruiser 50 yards from the main entrance, standard protocol for an unknown situation. The building was 4 stories tall, with a loading dock on the east side and what looked like office entrances on the north. Most of the windows on the upper floors were broken, but the ground floor had been boarded up at some point, though several of the boards had been pried away. Sarah keyed her radio. "Unit K-97 on scene at Westfield Industrial, Building 7. Beginning preliminary assessment. Copy that, K-97. Be advised we're short-staffed due to the incident on I-85. Nearest backup is 20 minutes out. Understood. We'll advise if backup is needed." She turned to Mercer. "We go in quiet, clear the ground floor, assess whether we need additional units. Stay close, communicate, don't take unnecessary risks." "Got it." He checked his weapon, his movements smooth and practiced. They approached the building from the north side, moving along the wall toward a door where the boards had been removed. Sarah went first, weapon drawn, flashlight in her offhand. The interior was dark despite the late morning sun, the boarded windows blocking most of the light. The smell hit her immediately. Dust, old machinery oil, something chemical she couldn't identify. and underneath it, fainter, the smell of recent human habitation, food wrappers maybe, unwashed bodies. She swept her flashlight across the space. It was a large room, maybe a former reception area, with a concrete floor and walls covered in decades of grime. Doorways led off in 3 directions, and a metal staircase climbed toward the upper floors. She signaled Mercer to cover the left doorway while she checked the right. Standard clearing procedure, room by room, corner by corner. The right doorway led to a long corridor lined with what had once been offices. Doors hung open, some missing entirely. Sarah moved down the hallway, checking each room quickly. Empty. Debris. Old furniture. No signs of recent activity. She was about to turn back when she heard it. A soft sound from somewhere deeper in the building, a scrape like something being dragged across concrete. She keyed her radio, keeping her voice low. "Mercer, I've got possible contact East Corridor. Moving to investigate. Copy. I'm in the West Wing. Nothing so far. Want me to join you? Negative. Hold position. Cover the entrance. I'll advise." She moved deeper into the corridor, toward a set of double doors at the far end. The sound came again, louder now, definitely something moving. She pushed through the doors and found herself in what had once been a factory floor. Massive machines stood silent and rusting, creating a maze of metal and shadow. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes floating in the stagnant air. "Atlanta PD," she called out. "Anyone in here, make yourself known." Silence. Then, from somewhere to her left, a voice. Thin, frightened. "Please, help me." Sarah moved toward the voice, her weapon sweeping the shadows. She rounded a large piece of machinery and found him. A young man, maybe 20, sitting on the concrete floor with his back against a support column. His face was pale, his eyes wide, his hands bound in front of him with zip ties. What the hell? She approached cautiously, checking corners, watching for movement. The young man looked up at her with desperate eyes. "Please," he said again, "they're going to kill me. You have to get me out of here." "Who's going to kill you?" Sarah knelt beside him, keeping her weapon ready. "Who did this to you?" Before he could answer, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun, bringing her weapon up. Mercer stood in the doorway, his gun holstered, his hands raised. "Easy, Lieutenant. It's just me. I told you to hold position. I heard voices, thought you might need backup." He walked toward her, his eyes on the bound young man. "What have we got? Victim, bound, possible kidnapping." She turned back to the young man. "Who did this to you? How long have you been here?" The young man's eyes shifted, looking at something behind her. Sarah started to turn. The blow caught her on the back of the head. She went down hard, her vision exploding into white static, her weapon clattering across the concrete. She tried to push herself up, but the world was spinning, and then something hit her again, and the white static turned to black. Consciousness returned in fragments. The feel of concrete under her cheek, the taste of blood in her mouth, the sound of voices, muffled at first, then gradually coming into focus. She's waking up. Give her another minute. I want her coherent for this. Sarah kept her eyes closed, using the time to assess. Her hands were bound behind her back, zip ties biting into her wrists. Her ankles were similarly restrained. She was lying on her side on a hard floor. Her head throbbed with a pain that made her want to vomit. She opened her eyes. She was in a different room now, smaller than the factory floor, a basement maybe. Given the low ceiling and the concrete walls, a single bare bulb provided harsh illumination. Her radio and weapon were gone. Her phone was gone. Derek Mercer sat in a metal chair 3 feet away, watching her with an expression of mild interest. Behind him, leaning against the wall, was the young man who had been bound on the factory floor. He wasn't bound anymore. He was smoking a cigarette, looking bored. Mercer smiled. "There she is. How's the head, Lieutenant?" Sarah didn't answer. She was calculating. The room appeared to have one door, metal, closed. No windows, no other exits she could see. "Let me save you some time," Mercer said, reading her thoughts. There's no way out of here except through that door, and you're not getting through that door. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. So let's talk instead. Sarah met his eyes. About what? About where the money is. What money? Mercer sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment. Lieutenant Collins, please. Let's not do this. We both know what I'm talking about. The Reyes cartel seizure 4 years ago. 47 million in cash. He paused. Except it wasn't 47 million when it got logged into evidence. It was 32 million, which means $15 million went somewhere, and you were lead officer on that raid. Sarah felt ice slide down her spine. The Reyes case, 4 years ago. The biggest drug bust in Atlanta history. A joint operation with the DEA that had taken down one of the largest cartel operations on the East Coast. She remembered every detail of that night. The gunfire, the chaos, the bodies. You don't know what you're talking about, she said. Mercer's smile didn't waver. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've spent 2 years tracking that money. 2 years putting together the pieces. And every piece points to you, Lieutenant. You and your K-9 unit. He stood up, pacing slowly. You found something during that raid, didn't you? Something that wasn't in the official report. A hidden compartment, a secondary stash. And you decided to keep it for yourself. You're insane, maybe, but I'm also very motivated. He stopped pacing, looked down at her. The Reyes family wants their money back, Lieutenant, and they're willing to pay very well to anyone who can retrieve it. They're also willing to do very unpleasant things to anyone who stands in the way. Sarah's mind was racing. The Reyes cartel. She had thought they were finished, dismantled, their leadership either dead or in prison. But cartels didn't die easily. Cut off one head and 2 more grew back. I didn't take any money, she said, her voice flat. There was no hidden stash. The seizure was documented, witnessed, logged, according to procedure. Mercer shook his head. The seizure was chaos. Your own report admits that. Multiple buildings, multiple suspects, active gunfire. In that kind of situation, things get missed. She studied his face, looking for any crack in his composure, or things get found and not reported. He crouched down beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Let me tell you what's going to happen, Lieutenant. You're going to tell me where that money is. You're going to give me account numbers, locations, whatever I need to recover it. And then, depending on how cooperative you've been, we'll discuss what happens next. And if I don't know anything? Mercer's expression didn't change. Then this is going to be a very long night for you. He stood up, nodded to the young man by the wall. Let's give her some time to think. He walked toward the door, then paused, looking back. Oh, and Lieutenant, your dog, the one that wouldn't get in the car with me. He smiled, and for the first time, the mask slipped, and Sarah saw something cold and empty behind his eyes. Animals are smarter than people give them credit for. He knew what I was. Pity you didn't listen to him. The door closed. A lock clicked. Sarah was alone. She lay still for a long moment, listening, footsteps receding, voices too muffled to make out, then silence. She began to work on her restraints. 12 miles away, Max was losing his mind. He had been pacing his kennel since Sarah left, a constant back-and-forth motion that the other handlers had noticed but couldn't explain. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't drink. He wouldn't respond to commands or treats or toys. He just paced, stopping only occasionally to press his nose against the chain link and stare in the direction Sarah had gone. Officer Denise Carter, who had been with the K-9 unit for 3 years, was the first to really pay attention. Something's wrong with him, she said to Sergeant Mike Torres, the shift supervisor. I've never seen him like this. Torres glanced at the kennel, frowning. Collins said he had a bad reaction to the new guy, Mercer. Maybe he's still worked up about it. This isn't worked up. This is... She searched for the word. Distressed. Torres shrugged. He'll calm down when she gets back. Where is she, anyway? Carter checked the dispatch log. Responded to a call at the Westfield Industrial Complex about 3 hours ago. She frowned. No update since then. Did she request backup? No. Said she'd advise if needed. They both looked at the dispatch log for a moment. 3 hours was a long time for a routine trespassing call. Try her radio, Torres said. Carter keyed her handset. Unit K-9, this is base. Please advise status. Static. Then nothing. She tried again. Lieutenant Collins, please respond. Nothing. Torres's frown deepened. Try her cell. Carter pulled out her phone, dialed. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. In his kennel, Max had stopped pacing. He was standing rigid, every muscle tense, staring at the 2 officers with an intensity that made Carter's skin prickle. Something's wrong, she said again, and this time Torres didn't argue. Over the next 30 minutes, the situation escalated. Calls to Sarah's phone went unanswered. Radio contact couldn't be established. A unit was dispatched to the Westfield Industrial Complex and found her cruiser parked outside Building 7. Empty, dashcam still running. No sign of Collins or Mercer. The dashcam footage was transmitted back to the precinct. Torres and Carter watched it in the Situation Room, along with Captain Elena Vasquez, who had been called in from a budget meeting when the phrase "officer missing" was used. The footage showed the drive to the complex, Sarah and Mercer's conversation en route, normal, professional. Then the arrival, the approach to the building, both officers exiting frame. For the next 3 hours, the camera recorded nothing but the empty parking lot. Heat shimmer rising from the cracked asphalt. Weeds swaying in occasional gusts of hot wind. Then, at the 2-hour 40-minute mark, the rear door of the cruiser opened. Mercer's face appeared in frame, leaning in to check the dashboard. His expression was calm, focused. He pressed a button, and the recording ended. "Son of a bitch," Torres breathed. "He killed the dashcam," Carter said. He knew it was recording. Vasquez's face was carved from stone. "Pull his file, everything we have on Derek Mercer, and get me Houston PD on the line." 20 minutes later, they had their answer. Houston PD had never heard of Derek Mercer. His service record was fabricated. His recommendations were forged. The man who had been riding with Sarah Collins for the past 5 hours was a complete unknown. "We need to find her," Vasquez said. "Now." In his kennel, Max had stopped making any sound. He was standing at the chain link, utterly still, his eyes fixed on the door that led outside. Every few seconds, his body would shudder with suppressed energy, like a coiled spring being wound tighter and tighter. Carter was the one who noticed. "Captain," she said slowly, "I think we should bring Max." Vasquez turned. "The dog. Can he track her?" Carter shook her head. "Normally we'd need a scent article, a starting point, but—" She looked at Max, at the terrible intensity in his eyes. "I don't think normal rules apply right now." Vasquez made a decision. "Get him. We're going to the industrial complex." Carter ran to the kennel and unlocked the door. Before she could attach a lead, Max was past her, a brown and black blur streaking toward the exit. She shouted after him, but he was already gone, pushing through a door that someone had left propped open, disappearing into the hot Atlanta afternoon. Max ran. He ran through the facility's parking lot, past startled officers, past barking dogs in other kennels. He hit the street and didn't slow down, his paws striking pavement in a rhythm that ate up distance with mechanical efficiency. He didn't know how he knew where to go. There was no scent trail, no visual cue, nothing that his training had prepared him for. There was only a certainty that burned in his chest, an absolute knowledge that Sarah was in danger and that he had to find her. He ran north, cutting through parking lots and side streets, ignoring honking horns and shouted curses. He ran past the gleaming towers of Midtown, past the construction sites and the coffee shops and the people who stopped to stare at the dog sprinting like his life depended on it. Maybe it did. Maybe hers did. The connection between a K-9 and his handler was something trainers talked about but couldn't quite explain. It was built on repetition, on shared experience, on thousands of hours of working together until two minds began to function as one. But there was something else too, something that went beyond training, beyond conditioning, something that lived in the space between heartbeats. Max ran for 45 minutes without stopping. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, his paws left bloody prints on the concrete. But he didn't slow down, not once, because somewhere ahead of him, Sarah was waiting, and he would die before he let her down. The industrial complex materialized out of the heat haze like a mirage. Max slowed as he approached, his exhaustion forgotten as his senses kicked into overdrive. He could smell the building now, the rust and dust and decay. And underneath that, fainter but unmistakable, the scent of Sarah. He found her cruiser, circled it once, confirming what he already knew. She wasn't here. She had gone inside and she hadn't come out. He approached the building, following the scent trail to the door with the removed boards. Inside, the smell was stronger. Sarah had been here, had walked these corridors, and there was another smell too, one that made his hackles rise and his lips peel back from his teeth. The man. The wrong man, the one who had smiled with his mouth but not his eyes. Max moved through the building like a ghost, his training asserting itself even through his exhaustion and fear. He cleared corners, checked shadows, moved from cover to cover. The scent trail led him deeper into the complex, through the abandoned offices, across the factory floor, and finally to a metal door that led down. He could hear them now. Voices muffled by concrete and steel. He could smell Sarah more strongly, along with blood and sweat and fear. But she was alive. He could sense that much. Her heartbeat was a distant rhythm that somehow harmonized with his own. He needed to get to her, but the door was locked and he couldn't open it. Max settled into the shadows beside the door and waited. In the basement, Sarah had made progress. The zip ties were military grade, designed to resist exactly the kind of manipulation she had been attempting, but she had found a jagged edge on the concrete floor, a spot where the surface had cracked and split, and she had been sawing at the plastic for the past hour. Her wrists were raw and bleeding, her shoulders ached from the awkward position, but she could feel the ties weakening, strand by strand, and she kept going. The door opened. She went still, feigning unconsciousness as footsteps approached. Still out, the voice was the young man's, the one who had pretended to be a victim. "She's been out for hours." Mercer sounded irritated. "Hit her harder than I meant to." "What do? We wait. She'll come around, and when she does, we'll start asking questions properly." The footsteps retreated. The door closed. Sarah resumed her work on the ties. 20 minutes later, she felt them give way. She kept her hands behind her back, hiding the broken restraints, and began working on her ankles. These were easier, allowing her to use her fingers, and within 10 minutes she was free. She lay still, thinking. She was unarmed in an unknown location, with at least 2 hostiles between her and freedom. She had no backup, no radio, no phone. She was injured, exhausted, and outnumbered. Standard odds for a Tuesday, she thought grimly, and almost smiled. She assessed the room again. The single door, the bare bulb, the metal chair Mercer had been sitting in, the concrete walls. Wait, the chair. She moved silently, picking it up, testing its weight. It was old, rusted, but solid. The legs were welded to the seat, but one of them was loose, wobbling when she applied pressure. She worked at it quietly, back and forth, until it came free in her hands. A length of rusty steel, about 18 inches long, with a jagged end where the weld had broken. Not a weapon she would have chosen, but it would do. She positioned herself beside the door, chair leg raised, and waited. The wait felt endless. Minutes stretched into what might have been hours. Her arms began to shake from holding the improvised weapon ready. Her head throbbed with every heartbeat. But she didn't move, didn't lower her guard, because she knew with absolute certainty that someone would come through that door eventually, and when they did, she would have exactly one chance. The footsteps came without warning, quick, purposeful. The lock clicked, the door swung open, the young man stepped through, a tray in his hands, water bottle, sandwich. His eyes went to the spot where Sarah should have been lying, and for one frozen moment, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. Sarah didn't give him time to figure it out. She swung the chair leg with every ounce of strength she had left. It connected with his temple, with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon. He went down without a word, the tray clattering to the floor, the water bottle rolling into the corner. Sarah was already moving. She grabbed the pistol from his waistband, a compact 9mm, and checked the magazine. Full. She chambered around and moved to the door. The hallway beyond was narrow, lit by more bare bulbs, with concrete walls and a floor that sloped gradually upward. She moved along it, weapon raised, clearing corners, listening for any sound. She found the stairs at the end of the hallway, metal, industrial, spiraling upward into darkness. She began to climb. She was halfway up when she heard the shout from below. "She's gone! The kid's down! She's loose!" Mercer's voice, furious, dangerous. Sarah abandoned stealth and ran. She burst through a door at the top of the stairs and found herself in the factory floor she had searched earlier. It was darker now, the sun having shifted, shadows pooling between the rusting machines. She oriented herself, remembered the layout, and headed for the corridor that led to the exit. She was almost there when Mercer stepped out of the shadows. He had a gun aimed at her chest. His face was no longer wearing its professional mask. What she saw now was cold, calculating rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. Sarah stopped, her own weapon trained on him. "We can both put these down." "No." He shook his head slowly. "No, I don't think so. You've seen my face. You know I'm not who I said I was. There's no version of this where you walk away. Then I guess we have a problem." Mercer smiled, but there was no humor in it. "The money, Collins. Last chance. Tell me where it is." "There is no money." Sarah's voice was steady despite her pounding heart. "There never was. The seizure was documented, verified, logged. Whatever your employers think happened, they're wrong. My employers are never wrong. They have sources inside your department, sources who confirmed that 15 million went missing that night. Then your sources lied, or they were misinformed, or they're setting you up." Sarah kept her eyes on Mercer's gun hand, watching for any twitch. "But I didn't take anything. I've never taken anything, and killing me isn't going to change that. Maybe not." Mercer's finger tightened on the trigger. "But it'll make me feel better." A sound split the air. Not a gunshot, something else. A snarl, deep and primal, followed by the scrabble of claws on concrete. Mercer turned. Max came out of the darkness like a guided missile. 70 pounds of muscle and fury hit Mercer at full speed, driving him backward, knocking the gun from his hand. Max's jaws clamped down on his arm, and Mercer screamed, a sound of pure animal terror. Sarah didn't hesitate. She closed the distance in 3 strides and brought the butt of her pistol down on Mercer's skull. Once, twice. He went limp, and Max held on for another 3 seconds before responding to her command. "Max, release, guard." The dog let go, positioned himself over Mercer's unconscious body, and looked up at Sarah with eyes that held equal parts exhaustion and triumph. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands running over his coat, checking for injuries. His paws were torn and bloody. His muscles trembled with fatigue, but he was alive and he was here, and Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she pulled him close. "How did you find me?" she whispered into his fur. "How did you know?" Max didn't answer, of course. He just pressed his head against her shoulder and let out a long, shuddering breath. They stayed like that for a moment, human and dog, In the darkness of an abandoned factory, surrounded by rust and shadows, and the unconscious body of a man who had tried to destroy them both. Then Sarah pulled herself together, secured Mercer with his own zip ties, and keyed the radio she found on his belt. "This is Lieutenant Collins. I need immediate backup at Westfield Industrial Complex, Building 7. One suspect in custody, one additional suspect incapacitated in the basement. I'm requesting medical for myself and my K-9. The response was immediate, a burst of voices and sirens and the promise of help on the way. Sarah sat down with her back against a rusting machine. Max pressed against her side and waited for the cavalry to arrive. The next 6 hours were a blur of activity. Paramedics, crime scene techs, federal agents, internal affairs investigators. The abandoned building transformed into a hive of law enforcement personnel, everyone trying to piece together what had happened. Mercer was taken into federal custody. His real name, they learned, was Marcus Webb, a former private military contractor with ties to half a dozen cartels across the Americas. He had been on Interpol's watch list for 3 years, wanted in connection with kidnappings, extortion, and at least 4 murders. The young man in the basement, who turned out to be named Tyler Briggs, was a low-level associate who had been recruited for what he thought was a simple con job. He gave up everything he knew within the first hour of interrogation, desperate to distance himself from Webb's more serious crimes. The money, it turned out, was real. Captain Vasquez delivered the news to Sarah personally in a quiet corner of Atlanta General Hospital where Sarah was being treated for a concussion and dehydration. "Internal Affairs has been investigating for 6 months, Vasquez said. "Someone in the department did skim from the Reyes seizure. It wasn't 15 million, it was closer to 3, and it wasn't you." Sarah looked up from the bed where she was resting. Max curled at her feet despite the nurse's protests. "Who?" Vasquez hesitated. "Lieutenant Frank Morrison." Morrison. Sarah felt something twist in her chest. He had been one of the senior officers on the Reyes raid. He had retired 2 years later, citing health issues. She'd sent him a card. "He died 6 months ago," Vasquez continued. "Heart attack. The money trail led back to him, but by the time we figured it out, he was gone. The Reyes family must have gotten the same information, just with the wrong name attached. They thought it was me. Webb certainly did, and he was willing to do anything to get what he thought you had." Vasquez paused. "If your dog hadn't found you—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Sarah looked down at Max, at his bandaged paws and his exhausted eyes, at the way he hadn't left her side since the factory. "How did he find me?" she asked. "There was no scent trail, no starting point. How did he know where I was?" Vasquez shook her head. "The K-9 trainers don't know. The behaviorists don't know. Best guess is some combination of scent memory, pattern recognition, and pure instinct." She looked at Max with something like awe. "Or maybe it's something we don't have words for." Sarah stroked Max's ear, felt him press into her touch. "Maybe." The investigation continued for weeks. Webb was extradited to face charges in multiple jurisdictions. Briggs pleaded guilty to conspiracy and kidnapping, earning himself a 12-year sentence. The Reyes cartel, deprived of their operative and their imagined fortune, retreated back into the shadows. Sarah was cleared of any wrongdoing and returned to duty after 2 weeks of mandatory medical leave. Max's paws healed, and he passed his recertification with flying colors. The department offered them both commendations, which Sarah accepted with characteristic modesty and Max accepted with characteristic indifference. But something had changed between them. The bond that had always been strong was now something else entirely, forged in crisis and tempered by trust. Sarah found herself talking to Max more, not just commands and praise, but real conversation, as if she half expected him to answer. Maybe he did. In his way, in the tilt of his head, the position of his ears, the way he would look at her with those deep brown eyes that seemed to see everything she was thinking. 3 months later, they were back on patrol, driving through Atlanta on a cool October evening. The leaves were turning and the city sparkled with the promise of fall. A call came over the radio. Suspicious activity at a warehouse on the south side. Possible drug operation. Sarah reached for the handset, then paused. She looked over at Max, who was sitting in the back seat, ears perked, ready for action. "What do you think, partner?" she asked. "You ready?" Max's answer was a soft bark, eager and confident. Sarah smiled and keyed the radio. Unit K-9 responding. ETA 10 minutes. She pulled onto the highway, Max watching the city slide past, and together they drove toward whatever came next. The warehouse call turned out to be more complicated than expected. Not just drugs, but a distribution hub for a network that stretched across 3 states. By the time they had secured the scene and called for backup, Sarah had 5 suspects in custody and enough evidence to make the district attorney very happy. Max had found the hidden compartment where the product was stored, a false wall that human officers had walked past 3 times without noticing. His nose had led them to a fortune in contraband, and more importantly, to documents that would help dismantle the entire operation. "Good boy," Sarah told him as they waited for the processing team to arrive. "Very good boy." Max accepted the praise with dignity, then went back to watching the suspects with the calm confidence of a professional who knew exactly how good he was at his job. They were leaving the scene when Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Captain Vasquez. "Need to see you first thing tomorrow. Important." Sarah showed the message to Max, a habit she had developed. "What do you think? Good news or bad news?" Max tilted his head, considering, then let out a small huff that Sarah chose to interpret as cautious optimism. She slept poorly that night, her mind churning through possibilities. Another assignment, a new partner, promotion, demotion. Some new crisis that would require her specific skills and Max's specific nose. By the time she walked into Vasquez's office the next morning, Max at her heel, she had imagined a dozen scenarios, each more dramatic than the last. The reality was something she hadn't considered. "We've had a request," Vasquez said, sliding a folder across her desk, "from the FBI. They're putting together a joint task force to address cartel operations along the East Coast, cross-jurisdictional, long-term, high-level targets." Sarah opened the folder. Photographs, organizational charts, threat assessments, names she recognized from the Reyes investigation and others she didn't. "They want me, they want both of you." Vasquez nodded toward Max. "Your work on the Reyes case, the Webb situation, and now this warehouse operation has caught their attention. They think you'd be an asset." Sarah studied the documents, her mind racing. A federal task force was a big deal. Bigger targets, bigger stakes, bigger resources. It was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a career. It would also mean leaving Atlanta, leaving the department that had been her home for over a decade, leaving the routines and relationships that defined her daily life. She looked down at Max, who was watching her with his usual attentive expression. "What do you think, partner?" Max didn't answer, but his tail wagged once, a single sweep that might have meant anything or nothing. Sarah closed the folder and met Vasquez's eyes. "Can I have some time to think about it? You have 48 hours. They're eager, Collins. Don't make them wait too long." Sarah spent those 48 hours the way she spent most of her off-duty time, with Max at her side, working through the decision in the only way she knew how. Long walks through the city, hours at the K-9 training facility, running drills that neither of them really needed. Late nights on her couch, Max's head in her lap, the television playing shows neither of them watched. She called her mother, who told her to follow her heart. She called her sister, who told her to follow the money. She called her former partner from her patrol days, who told her that opportunities like this didn't come twice, but none of them understood what she was really asking. None of them knew what it meant to have a partner who couldn't speak, but who communicated more clearly than anyone she had ever met. On the second night, she took Max to Piedmont Park, their favorite spot for thinking. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves crunching under their feet, the city lights glittering beyond the trees. She sat on their usual bench, and Max settled beside her, his warm weight pressing against her leg. 7 years, she said quietly. 7 years we've been together, through everything, and you've never let me down, not once. Max made a soft sound, something between a sigh and a groan, and pressed closer. This task force. It would be dangerous. Long hours, difficult cases, probably time away from everything familiar. She paused, scratching behind his ear. But it would also be important, really important, the kind of work that could make a real difference. Max turned his head to look at her, his brown eyes reflecting the distant city lights. "What do I want?" Sarah asked him. "What do we want?" The answer came not in words, but in feeling, in the certainty that had carried her through every crisis, every decision, every moment of doubt. In the knowledge that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. She knew what she was going to do. The next morning, she walked into Vasquez's office and accepted the position. The task force was everything she had expected, and more. Based out of Atlanta but operating across the entire eastern seaboard, they tackled cases that would have been impossible for any single department. Drug pipelines stretching from Florida to Maine, human trafficking networks hidden in plain sight, money laundering operations that moved billions through legitimate businesses. Sarah and Max were assigned to the investigative unit, their job to follow leads, develop intelligence, and provide operational support during raids. It was demanding work, requiring long hours and constant travel, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way that regular patrol had never been. Max thrived in the new environment. The federal handlers quickly recognized his exceptional abilities, and he became something of a legend within the task force. There were cases that hinged entirely on his nose, suspects who would have escaped if not for his tracking skills, hidden compartments that only he could detect. But the adjustment wasn't without challenges. 6 months into the assignment, they were in Miami, working a case involving a shipping company that was moving more than just cargo. The target was a warehouse near the port, and the operation was supposed to be straightforward. Surveillance, confirmation, then a coordinated raid with local law enforcement. It didn't go that way. Someone had tipped off the targets. When the raid team moved in, they found the warehouse empty except for a skeleton crew and a whole lot of nothing. The main players had vanished hours before, along with whatever evidence might have tied them to the larger network. The leak was obvious. Finding it was not. Sarah spent the next 3 weeks running down every possible source. Task force members, local cops, federal agents, informants. Anyone who had known about the operation became a suspect. The investigation brought her to dark places. Places where trust was a liability and paranoia was a survival skill. She questioned people she had worked alongside for months, analyzed communications and financial records, built timelines and connection maps that covered entire walls. Through it all, Max was her constant, her sounding board, her emotional anchor, the one presence she never had to doubt. Late at night, in anonymous hotel rooms across the southeast, she would talk through her theories while he listened, his head tilting at key points, as if he were actually following the logic. Maybe he was. At this point, nothing would surprise her. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A low-level dealer they had arrested in a separate case offered information in exchange for consideration. The kind of deal prosecutors made every day, trading small fish for bigger ones. What he knew was explosive. The leak wasn't inside the task force. It was higher up, much higher, a deputy director at the FBI field office in Atlanta, had been on the cartel payroll for over a decade. He had access to operational planning, could monitor task force communications, and had been systematically sabotaging investigations for years. Deputy Director William Harmon, a 30-year veteran, commendations, awards, a reputation for integrity that had never been questioned. Sarah brought the information to her task force commander, a steely-eyed woman named Assistant Director Janet Monroe. Monroe listened without interrupting, reviewed the evidence Sarah had compiled, and then sat in silence for a long moment. "This is going to get ugly," Monroe said finally. "I know. If we're wrong, careers are over, including yours." "I know." Monroe studied her. "And if we're right, then we take down one of the most dangerous moles in federal law enforcement history." Sarah met her eyes steadily, "and we send a message that nobody is above the law, not even our own." Monroe nodded slowly. "Then let's do it right." The investigation into Harmon took another 2 months. Every step had to be documented. Every piece of evidence had to be verified. They built the case with the painstaking precision of master craftsmen, knowing that any flaw would be exploited by defense attorneys and sympathetic colleagues. Max played a crucial role. Harmon had been careful, but not careful enough. He had met with cartel intermediaries in locations he thought were secure, exchanged packages he thought were untraceable. Max tracked him to 3 separate meetings, his nose detecting the scent of the intermediaries on Harmon's clothing and in his car. The evidence was enough to obtain warrants. The warrants were enough to find the financial records. The financial records were enough to prove a pattern of corruption stretching back more than 15 years. When the arrest came, Sarah wasn't there. She had requested to be excluded, knowing that her presence might compromise the case. But she watched the footage later, saw Harmon led out of his office in handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. She felt no satisfaction, only a grim sense of closure. Harmon was convicted on 47 counts, ranging from bribery to obstruction of justice to conspiracy to commit murder. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, a monument to the corruption that could flourish even in the heart of law enforcement. The task force celebrated, but Sarah felt oddly hollow. The victory was important, but it came at a cost. Trust had been shattered, relationships destroyed, illusions stripped away. She had learned things about the system she served that would never leave her. That night, alone in her apartment with Max, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. He put his head in her lap, and she stroked his fur, and neither of them needed to say anything. 2 years later, Sarah was promoted to lead the task force's Atlanta division. It was recognition of her work, her integrity, and her results. But it also meant more responsibility, more pressure, more distance from the field work she loved. Max was getting older. At 9, he was still sharp, still capable, but the years were showing in subtle ways. Slower to rise in the morning, stiffer after long runs, grey creeping into the fur around his muzzle. Veterinary evaluations confirmed what Sarah already knew. Max had another year, maybe 2, of active duty before retirement would become necessary. His body was beginning to fail, even as his mind and spirit remained strong. She found herself treasuring their time together in ways she hadn't before. Every case became precious, every success a gift. She took more photos, kept more detailed records, tried to preserve what she knew would soon be memory. The end, when it came, wasn't dramatic. No final showdown, no heroic sacrifice, just a routine operation that became more complicated than expected. They were tracking a suspect through an industrial area, a nighttime pursuit that had Sarah and Max working in tandem the way they had hundreds of times before. The suspect was armed, dangerous, and desperate. He had killed 2 people already and had nothing to lose. Max found him first. In a narrow alley between two buildings, the suspect cornered, his gun raised. What happened next was over in seconds. The suspect fired. Max moved to intercept. Sarah returned fire. When the smoke cleared, the suspect was down, a bullet in his shoulder. Max was standing over him, teeth bared, blood streaming from a wound in his side. Sarah called for medical, for veterinary support, for everything she could think of. She applied pressure to Max's wound while backup arrived, talking to him constantly, telling him he was okay. He was going to be fine. He was the best dog in the world. He looked up at her with those brown eyes, calm despite the pain, and she knew he understood. The surgery took 4 hours. The bullet had nicked an artery, caused internal bleeding, damaged tissue that would never fully heal. The veterinarian was cautiously optimistic, but honest. "He'll recover," she said, "but his field career is over. I'm sorry." Sarah nodded, unable to speak. She stayed at the clinic all night, sleeping in a chair beside Max's kennel. When he woke, groggy and confused, she was there, her hand on his head, her voice in his ear. "You did so good," she whispered. "You did everything right. I'm so proud of you." His tail wagged weakly, and despite everything, she smiled. Max's retirement was official 3 weeks later. A ceremony at the K-9 facility, attended by everyone who had worked with them, everyone who had been touched by their partnership. There were speeches and awards and a formal transfer of ownership that made Max officially Sarah's property rather than the department's. Through it all, Max sat with the dignity of a veteran who had earned every honor being bestowed upon him. He accepted treats and praise from colleagues, tolerated photos with admiring officers, and generally behaved as if he'd been training for this moment his entire life. Maybe he had. Maybe they both had. After the ceremony, Sarah took him home. Not to the apartment she had occupied for the past decade, but to a house she had purchased 6 months earlier. A place with a yard, a fence, room to run. A place for retirement. Max explored every inch of it, sniffing corners and investigating closets, his tail wagging with an enthusiasm that belied his injuries. When he finally settled on the couch, Sarah sat beside him, and together they watched the sun set through the living room window. "So," she said, "what do we do now?" Max looked at her, tilted his head, and let out a soft bark. She laughed. "Yeah, I guess we figure it out together, like always." The years that followed were quieter than anything Sarah had known. She continued to lead the task force division, building on the work they had done together, training new handlers and K-9 teams, shaping the future of the unit she had helped create. Max adapted to civilian life with grace. He greeted Sarah at the door every evening, accompanied her on walks through the neighborhood, and generally behaved like a dog who had earned every comfort and intended to enjoy them all. But he never fully stopped working. When Sarah brought case files home, he would settle beside her on the couch, watching as she reviewed documents, occasionally sniffing at photographs as if he might detect something she had missed. When she practiced training scenarios with new K-9 teams, he would watch from the sidelines, his body language critiquing their performance in ways that the handlers learned to interpret. He was still her partner, would always be her partner. The only difference was that now they worked from home. 3 years after his retirement, on a crisp November morning, Sarah woke to find Max standing at the back door, staring out at the yard. His body was rigid, his ears forward, his posture carrying an alertness that she hadn't seen in months. She got up, went to his side, looked out at what he was seeing. A young woman stood at the fence, holding a leash attached to a Belgian Malinois puppy. The puppy was watching Max with undisguised fascination. The woman smiled. "You're Lieutenant Collins, right? I'm Officer Jennifer Martinez. I just joined the K-9 unit. They told me you might be able to give me some advice." Sarah looked at Martinez, at the puppy, at Max, whose tail had begun to wag. "Come in," she said. "Tell me about your partner." They talked for 3 hours, about training, about communication, about the bond that would develop between handler and K-9 if given the chance, about the sacrifices and rewards, the dangers and triumphs, the moments of pure connection that made all of it worthwhile. Max sat beside them, watching the puppy with the patience of a mentor. When Martinez finally left, promising to return for more guidance, he stood at the window and watched them go. Sarah knelt beside him. "You miss it, don't you?" Max turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw everything they had shared. Every case, every crisis, every moment of trust and loyalty and love. She saw the factory where he had found her, the years of partnership that had shaped them both, the future they had built together. "Me too," she said softly. "Me too." That night, lying in bed with Max curled at her feet, Sarah thought about everything that had brought them to this moment, the career she had built, the cases they had solved, the people they had saved and the ones they hadn't, the choices that had led her to this house, this life, this extraordinary dog who had changed everything. She thought about Marcus Webb and his false identity, about the money that had never existed, about the chase through abandoned warehouses that had almost ended her life. She thought about Deputy Director Harmon and his decades of corruption, about the institutions that were supposed to protect and the people who betrayed them. Most of all, she thought about Max, about the day he had refused to ride with Mercer, the instinct that had warned him of danger when nothing else could, about his impossible journey across Atlanta to find her, the bond that had guided him when reason could not. She had never fully understood how he had done it. She had stopped trying. Some things were beyond explanation, beyond science, beyond everything she thought she knew about how the world worked. Some things were simply real, and that was enough. 5 more years passed. Sarah eventually retired from the task force, accepting a position as a consultant and trainer. It was less intense work, more flexible hours, the kind of arrangement that suited this phase of her life. Max slowed further, as old dogs do. His hips gave him trouble. His hearing faded. His eyes developed cataracts that dimmed, but never extinguished the intelligence behind them. Through it all, he remained himself, still watching for danger, still protecting his partner, still carrying the spirit of the working dog he had been, even as his body grew fragile. The end came on a Sunday morning in April, when the dogwoods were blooming and the air smelled like spring. Sarah woke to find Max lying beside her bed, his breathing labored, his eyes open but unfocused. She knew immediately what was happening. She had known for weeks, really, watching him decline, preparing herself for what couldn't be avoided. She lay down beside him on the floor, wrapped her arms around his thin body, and held him as she had held him 1,000 times before. In warehouses and patrol cars, in hospital rooms and celebration ceremonies, in all the moments that had made them partners. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, "it's okay. You can rest now." Max's tail moved, a small gesture, the ghost of all the wags that had come before. "You're the best dog," she said, tears streaming down her face. "The best partner, the best friend I ever had. I love you. I'll always love you." His breathing slowed, his body relaxed against hers, and then, with a soft sigh that sounded almost like contentment, K-9 Max closed his eyes for the last time. Sarah stayed with him for a long time. She didn't know how long. The sun moved across the floor, the house grew quiet, and she held her partner and let the grief wash over her in waves. When she finally rose, she did what needed to be done, called the people who needed to be called, made the arrangements that needed to be made, moved through the motions of loss with the discipline that had carried her through everything else. But that night, alone in the house that suddenly felt too big, she allowed herself to fall apart. She cried until she had no tears left, cried for the dog who had saved her life, who had known her better than anyone, who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return, cried for the partnership that was over, the future they wouldn't share, the presence that would never fill this space again. And when the tears finally stopped, when exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, she thought she heard something. A soft bark, distant but clear, coming from somewhere beyond the walls of the house. Maybe it was her imagination, maybe it was a neighbor's dog, maybe it was just the sound of her broken heart trying to heal, or maybe, just maybe, it was Max, telling her one last time that everything was going to be okay. She smiled through her tears and closed her eyes. The dashcam footage from that day in the industrial complex became part of K-9 training curriculum. Sarah contributed to the case study, explaining what had happened, what she had missed, what Max had known that she had failed to understand. The video was analyzed frame by frame, moment by moment, every detail examined for lessons that future handlers could learn. How to read a dog's body language, how to trust instincts over paperwork, how to recognize danger before it became disaster. But the most important lesson couldn't be captured on video. It was the thing Sarah told every new handler she trained, the truth that had defined her partnership with Max and would define her life going forward. Listen to your dog, she said. When everything else fails, when nothing else makes sense, listen to your dog. They know things we don't. They see things we can't. They will never, ever let you down if you give them the chance. It was the lesson Max had taught her, the lesson his life had proved, the lesson she would carry forward into whatever came next, because that's what partners do. They hold on, they trust, they never let go, not even when goodbye is the only option left.